Just 5 minutes ago, the quiet that had wrapped itself around the British throne finally cracked wide open. Standing shoulder to shoulder with Prince William, Princess Anne stepped forward and said out loud what the palace had spent weeks refusing to admit. King Charles had formally laid down his active duties as sovereign. Then, a second announcement landed even harder. William's coronation was no longer a possibility written into some far-off timeline. The date had been locked in, Westminster Abbey had been notified, and the wheels of succession were already turning. The future everyone had spoken about in whispers was suddenly the present. Before we go any deeper into what all of this really means for the House of Windsor, take a moment to subscribe so nothing slips past you. Anne kept her composure, but anyone listening closely could hear the tension threaded through every syllable. William stood beside her, and the empty space where Charles and Camilla should have been said everything. This was not a family update. This was a constitutional handover, the formal passing of royal authority from one sovereign to the next, and every person watching understood that the shape of history had just shifted permanently. The princess spoke first. Through a recorded palace address released shortly afterward, she confirmed that Charles had formally stepped away from his active duties as sovereign. Then she named the date that rewrote the future of the monarchy. Saturday, the 17th of October, 2026. On that morning, William would be crowned inside Westminster Abbey, the ancient church where British coronations have always taken place. The order was signed, the choice was sealed. There would be no backing away from what had already been set in motion. William drew in a slow breath before he began. There was no smile on the prince's face and no trace of triumph in his voice. He said the crown had reached him only through his father's sacrifice, and no ceremony on earth could soften the ache buried inside that truth. His words stayed steady, yet grief pressed against every one of them. He had spent decades preparing for duty. He had never once prepared to receive it because his father could no longer carry it. Anne met that sorrow with discipline. She honored her brother's service, but her voice tightened when she spoke of the weight he had shouldered for so long. As a sister, she loved Charles fiercely. As a princess, she now had to steady his son and guide him toward the throne Charles could no longer occupy. Loyalty pulled her one direction, duty pulled her the other. Then came the blow no one outside the inner circle had seen coming. Preparations for the coronation had not started that morning at all. The Archbishop of Canterbury, along with senior officials at Westminster Abbey, had received a sealed transition order weeks earlier. Someone deep inside the royal machinery had made absolutely certain that the date could not be argued, delayed, or undone. Then the briefing was over. William turned his head toward an empty chair that had been reserved for Charles. The king had intended to sit there, but something behind the closed doors of the palace had held him back, and that quiet, hidden moment was about to expose the private fear buried underneath the public decision. Beneath the polished official language, 4 people were living through 4 very different losses. Charles was giving up the authority he had waited a lifetime to hold. William was inheriting a crown long before he was emotionally ready to receive it. Anne was becoming the steady hand caught between 2 generations of kings. And Catherine was watching her husband move toward a destiny that would reshape every corner of their family life. The announcement belonged to the monarchy. The pain behind it was painfully, unmistakably human. Earlier that same morning, Charles had sat completely alone with the final transition statement resting in front of him. The king read every line slowly, including the sentence that formally ended his active sovereign duties. Sovereign duties are the official responsibilities the monarch carries out on behalf of the country. When his eyes reached his own signature, he turned the page over and said nothing at all. That silence revealed something the public statement never could. He understood, in complete clarity, exactly what he was letting go of. William was carrying a different kind of weight. The prince had spent his entire adult life preparing to become king one day. But somewhere in that preparation, he had always allowed himself to believe his father would remain between him and the crown for years yet to come. That buffer was gone now. Duty was no longer approaching in the distance. It was standing at his front door. Catherine had found him alone before the briefing, adjusting the same cuff over and over again. She reached out, placed her hand over his, and gently stilled the movement. The princess told him he did not have to pretend that any part of this felt like victory. William looked at her and said something he had not told Anne or his father. He was afraid. Catherine did not reach for empty comfort. She simply reminded him that fear was not a sign of weakness. It was proof he understood how much this would cost. Camilla felt the cost in a completely different way. The queen consort had always imagined finishing Charles's reign at his side, sharing the pressure, absorbing the criticism, walking through the final years of service as partners. His withdrawal did not just alter his title, it shook her influence, her public standing, and the future she had believed the two of them were building together. She did not confront him that morning, but a distance had already begun to open between them. Anne understood every crack running through the family. The princess had not simply supported the transition, she had overseen it, following a documented private conversation with her brother. Charles had asked her to make sure William did not refuse the crown out of guilt, or drag the coronation into delay in a misguided attempt to protect him. Catherine later learned why October had been chosen at all. The king feared that waiting any longer would breed rival factions, competing loyalties, and confusion about who truly held authority. He wanted the transfer completed before uncertainty had the chance to grow into a crisis. But the pain had begun before any of this. During a private ceremony at Windsor, Charles had experienced a hesitation so severe that Anne would later describe it, in a recorded family account, as the exact instant everything changed. That hidden moment was where the ending truly began. Every historic decision has one instant that cannot be taken back. For Charles, that instant unfolded inside Windsor Castle during a private investiture, attended by only a handful of relatives and senior aides. The ceremony had opened normally. Then, without warning, the king stopped speaking, lowered the insignia he was holding, and looked toward William as though the room around him had suddenly become foreign. What followed lasted under 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes forced the family to face a truth they had been dancing around for months. 3 weeks before the announcement, Charles had agreed to lead the small ceremony because the palace desperately needed a visible sign of stability. An investiture is the formal event where the monarch presents honors to individuals being recognized for their service. William, Anne, Catherine, and Camilla were all in attendance because the recipients had long-standing ties to the royal household. The gathering was small. The stakes were enormous. After months of scaled-back appearances, the family needed evidence that the king could still carry out the crown's most demanding responsibilities. Charles began with confidence. The monarch greeted the first recipient, lifted the insignia, and delivered the opening lines without so much as a stumble. And then, everything unraveled. He lost his place in the central declaration, repeated the opening sentence, and then fell into silence. The king stood frozen with the honor still resting in his hand. William watched his father's face grow tight. Catherine forgot to breathe for a moment. Camilla shifted toward her husband and then held still. William hesitated, waiting for Charles to recover. The prince believed that stepping forward would only expose his father's frailty in front of witnesses and turn a painful pause into a public humiliation. Then the king looked directly at him and whispered, "You must finish this." William refused at first. Charles repeated the command, this time with anger cutting through the shame in his voice. The future king suddenly understood that his refusal was no longer a form of protection, it was making everything worse. Camilla moved again, but Anne raised a single hand and stopped her. Where the queen consort saw cruelty in that gesture, the princess saw mercy. Comforting Charles before the room had emptied would leave him feeling watched, pitied, diminished. Catherine quietly redirected the attention of the witnesses toward William as he stepped in, completed the declaration, and presented the honor his father could no longer deliver. The door closed after the ceremony ended, but the crisis inside the family did not. Charles asked to see Anne alone and spoke to her through what would later become a documented private account placed in the family archive. The king admitted that what had happened was not simple exhaustion. He no longer trusted himself to guarantee the composure that being a sovereign demanded of him. Anne listened without interrupting once. Charles then asked his sister to begin preparing for the transition, but he attached a single condition to the request. William had to hear the decision from him directly. No official advisor, no formal document would speak on his behalf. The machinery of law and politics could wait. Before any dates, signatures, or proclamations were set, Charles had to look his eldest son in the eye and tell him that the throne now belonged to him. There were no advisors between them. No cameras preserved anything. Only a father, a son, and the crown that had shaped both their lives. Charles had rehearsed the words carefully. Yet when William walked into the room, the prepared statement stayed untouched on the desk. Instead, the king pushed his chair back, looked at the man who would replace him, and delivered a single sentence that broke the final barrier standing between private fear and public history. Charles had chosen a small sitting room inside Clarence House precisely because he wanted no officials shaping what was said. Clarence House is the London residence most closely associated with the king's private working life, quiet and removed from the ceremonial weight of Buckingham Palace. Anne waited elsewhere in the building, but she did not step inside. The princess understood that this exchange had to belong entirely to father and son. The king spoke first. He told William that the incident at Windsor had confirmed a fear he had been carrying alone for months. If he continued to reign while questioning his own composure, a single public failure could wound the monarchy more deeply than stepping aside ever would. Charles had devoted his whole life to defending the institution. He would not allow pride to become the thing that weakened it. "I cannot carry it further," he said. William did not answer with sympathy. The prince responded with anger, demanding to know how his father could decide the future without truly reckoning with what an immediate kingship would demand from Catherine, from George, from Charlotte, from Louis. He had prepared for the crown, but not for the sudden loss of time with the people he loved most. Charles listened, but the accusation struck deep. Then William asked the question that shifted the entire tone. Had the king actually chosen this himself, or had advisors slowly convinced him he had become a burden? Charles rose from his chair. The monarch insisted that this decision belonged to him and no one else. No courtier had pushed him, no doctor had ordered him out, no faction had maneuvered him aside. He was giving up power because holding on to it had become the greater danger. The silence between them stretched. Charles slid a transition paper across the desk. A transition paper is the formal written plan that transfers active royal authority and sets the next stage of succession into motion. William refused to reach for it. Charles then slipped the signet ring off his own hand and placed it beside the document. The ring carried his personal royal mark, a symbol of authority and consent. He told his son that he would not force him to feel ready, but he would require him to act responsibly. And then came the final revelation. October the 17th had been chosen by Charles himself. The coronation framework was already drafted and approved. The king wanted order. He did not want the image of a weakened monarch clinging to a throne he could no longer command. William finally picked up the paper, but he would not sign it until he knew exactly who had shaped the process behind the scenes, and who had tried to exploit it for themselves. When the royal family reached its most fragile hour, authority did not settle with the loudest voice inside the palace. It settled with Princess Anne. Charles trusted her because she wanted neither the throne nor the spotlight that came with it. William leaned on her because she would tell him the truth, even when the truth was painful. But Anne's grip on the transition also created enemies inside the household, particularly among those who feared that a new king would erase their influence long before the coronation bells were ever heard. Anne moved between private meetings, legal briefings, and coronation planning sessions without letting emotion slow her down for a moment. The princess became the central link connecting Charles, William, senior courtiers, constitutional advisors, and officials at Westminster. Constitutional advisors are the experts who guide the monarchy through lawful transfers of power. Her role was anything but ceremonial. She controlled the sequence in which authority would move, ensuring no office had the chance to stall the transfer or blur the line between the outgoing king and the incoming monarch. Charles reinforced that authority in writing. The king gave his sister formal power to keep October the 17th locked in, to restrict who knew about the plan, and to shut down any private lobbying before William signed. Anne understood exactly why. A single careless leak or a competing instruction could split the palace into two rival centers of loyalty overnight. Camilla confronted her before the next briefing. The queen consort demanded to know why she had been excluded from the earliest discussions. Anne answered without lifting her voice. This was a matter of sovereign authority, she said, not personal rank. Camilla heard judgment in those words. She accused the princess of treating her like an outsider after all the years she had stood beside Charles. Anne did not apologize. The queen walked away furious. William challenged her next. The prince resented the cold speed with which the transition was moving and warned her that treating his father like a constitutional problem would only deepen the family's suffering. Anne reminded him that stepping into kingship could not be handled like a private disagreement. William shot back that stripping every emotion out of the decision would turn him into the kind of monarch he had never wanted to become. Later, Anne sat alone with Charles and asked the question no one else had dared to ask. Did he regret choosing October? The king admitted that the date felt brutally close, yet delaying it any further would leave William trapped between prince and sovereign, saddled with responsibility but no clear authority to act on it. Then Anne uncovered the hidden proposal. A faction inside the senior household wanted Charles to hold on to nominal authority, while William quietly carried out most of the duties. Nominal authority means keeping the title while someone else does the real work. She dismissed it on the spot. Two power centers would turn father and son into rivals overnight. William eventually signed the acceptance papers. Within hours, fragments of the transition began slipping out from the very faction Anne had rejected. The coronation date was drifting toward the public before Charles had even had the chance to deliver his own final address, and the first cracks were already spreading beyond the palace walls. The moment William put pen to paper, the palace changed shape. Offices that had spent years serving Charles suddenly began receiving new directions. Courtiers who had waited on the king's approval were now told to bring their questions to the future monarch instead. Invitations were rewritten, seals were replaced. Even the language used inside private briefings shifted overnight. To some, it looked like an orderly transition. To others, it felt like a door quietly closing without warning. And behind one of those doors, Camilla was about to come face to face with what Charles's decision truly meant for her. William signed the formal acceptance papers, with Anne standing at his shoulder. The prince used Charles's own pen, and that small choice carried more meaning than any speech could have. Formal acceptance papers are the documents that confirm the heir will assume full sovereign responsibility and proceed toward coronation. Anne watched his hand hesitate before the final stroke. She understood he was not merely accepting authority. He was accepting the end of his father's active reign. The shift happened instantly. Palace departments began routing daily briefings, government communications, ceremonial approvals, and matters of state to William. The future king began receiving papers that only hours earlier had crossed his father's desk. That speed mattered enormously. Uncertainty at the very top could fracture the household, confuse ministers, and erode public trust. Every new instruction sharpened the reality of the transfer. Every cleared desk deepened the ache of it. Camilla learned about her own loss from a revised schedule. The queen consort read the page twice, took off her glasses, and asked why several state occasions no longer placed her beside Charles. She had expected his withdrawal to lighten their workload together, not dismantle the public partnership they had built side by side. The printed timetable made the truth feel cold, clinical, and final. Charles tried to explain himself. The king said William needed complete authority, free from mixed signals or divided attention. Camilla answered that he had shielded the crown while leaving her to discover the personal fallout through nothing more than an administrative page. She accused him of deciding their shared future entirely on his own. He did not deny it. That silence hurt her far more than any defense he could have offered. Then the crisis widened. A broadcaster received a confidential version of the October 17th coronation date before the official statement went out, and immediately launched an internal inquiry, a formal investigation into who had accessed and passed on the restricted plan. Anne feared the leak had not been careless at all. It had been engineered to make the transition look unstable. William soon traced the source. The information had traveled through an office linked to officials who had opposed Anne's clean transfer and wanted Charles to keep hold of part of the old authority. Their aim was delay, pressure, confusion. William refused to postpone a single thing. But before facing the public, the prince went to Charles alone. This time, he was not an heir seeking permission. He was the next king seeking peace before the crown separated them forever. There were no constitutional papers spread across the table this time. No advisors were waiting outside with instructions in hand. Charles and William sat across from one another as father and son, stripped of all the polite language that had shielded them from the hardest truths. One had spent his entire life waiting to become king. The other had spent his entire life knowing he would one day take his place. Now that moment had finally come, and neither man wanted their last exchange before the announcement to be defined by anger. William arrived late in the evening, after news of the coronation date had already slipped beyond palace walls. The prince asked for the room to be cleared, leaving no secretary, courtier, or official between them. That mattered. Every conversation before this one had been shaped by duty. This one had to be shaped by honesty. Charles spoke first. The king admitted that losing the crown was not what frightened him most. What terrified him was the thought that his son might inherit it carrying resentment. He had never wanted William to believe that stepping down was an act of abandonment, or one last burden dropped onto his shoulders. William finally answered without anger in his voice. He admitted that fear had been hiding beneath every accusation he had made. The future king worried about Catherine's health. He worried about the pressure already circling George, Charlotte, and Louis. He worried that kingship would pull him away from the family life he had fought so hard to protect. He had watched what duty could consume. He did not want his children to grow up feeling that same distance. Charles lowered his voice. The monarch acknowledged that the crown had already taken time from his own sons, and that responsibility had too often become an excuse for emotional silence. He told William not to repeat that mistake. A sovereign could serve his country without becoming unreachable to the people closest to him. Then Charles opened his hand. The signet ring rested in his palm, the very ring he had placed beside the transition papers earlier. A signet ring carries a personal royal mark and represents the authority of the person who owns it. The king did not ask his son to wear it. Instead, he closed William's fingers around it and told him to carry power without letting power harden him. William gave his father the reassurance he had been waiting to hear. The prince told him that this new reign would not erase Charles or diminish his place inside the family. He would attend the coronation with dignity, not as a defeated monarch, but as the man who had chosen stability over pride. The anger finally released its hold. Charles gave his blessing. William accepted it without any trace of triumph. The following morning, Anne stood beside the prince before they walked into the briefing room. This time, William did not hesitate. He carried the confirmed date, his father's ring, and the peace they had found together in private. Now, the country itself would decide what that sacrifice truly meant. Within minutes, the announcement crossed every border and cut through every broadcast. The words, "Charles steps down," appeared beneath footage of William and Anne standing shoulder to shoulder. Some viewers saw sacrifice. Others saw the abrupt end of an era they had believed would last much longer. Outside royal gates, strangers began gathering before officials had even set up the barriers. But one single image from Westminster captured the mood of the nation more powerfully than any headline, analyst, or palace statement ever could. Anne's recorded confirmation played on loop across every major network. The princess stated that Charles had stepped down and that William would be crowned on the 17th of October. A coronation is the formal ceremony in which a new monarch is publicly crowned and dedicated to serve the nation. That date became the anchor of every conversation almost immediately, because it proved the transition was neither distant nor speculative. It was already moving. Palace staff released a written statement honoring Charles's service and framing the change as planned, lawful, and unified. The king had personally approved the transfer, and that single detail carried enormous weight. Without his clear blessing, the public might have interpreted William's rise as a family struggle. With it, the moment became an act of sacrifice. Still, the country was emotionally divided. Some grieved for Charles and believed he had surrendered too soon. Others admired the monarch for placing stability above his own pride. William became the focus of rising hope. But the prince also inherited the burden of comparison before his reign had even begun. Camilla's absence from the announcement stirred a storm of its own. The queen consort had stood beside Charles through years of pressure, yet she was nowhere to be seen at the moment his reign effectively ended. Commentators began questioning whether her role had been quietly reduced. Later, Catherine arrived at William's side, offering quiet reassurance. Her presence calmed his supporters, but it also drew a sharp contrast between the old royal household and the new one now beginning to take shape. Then one moment silenced all the noise. Outside Buckingham Palace, a young boy leaned two handwritten cards against the railings. One read, "Thank you, King Charles." The other said, "Be brave, King William." Cameras caught the corners of the cards touching, and the crowd around them fell completely still. Gratitude and uncertainty had somehow found room in the same small space. A national newspaper delivered the final image. Its front page showed Charles walking out through a private doorway, while William walked in through another, beneath the words, "The crown passes." The headline turned a constitutional handover into a human story of departure and duty. As uncertainty slowly began softening into acceptance, attention started drifting toward Westminster Abbey. The question was no longer whether William would become king. The question was what Charles's final act had taught him about the true weight of the crown. In the end, this was not a story about a king being pushed aside, nor a son seizing power. It was the story of a father recognizing the precise moment when holding on would damage the thing he loved most. Charles stepped down because he understood that the crown belonged to something far larger than personal ambition. William accepted because refusing would have transformed sacrifice into instability. And Anne stood in the middle of them, making sure that love, regret, and pride never became strong enough to stop the monarchy from moving forward. William signed off on the final coronation plans for the 17th of October, 2026, with a single clear instruction. The ceremony had to honor tradition without becoming a display of excess. A coronation is the formal service in which a monarch is crowned and publicly dedicated to serve the nation. The prince wanted the day to feel historic, but he also wanted it to reflect restraint. His reign would begin with service, not spectacle. Charles then confirmed through a recorded palace statement that he would attend alongside Camilla. The king's choice quieted the deepest rumors of division. His presence would demonstrate that William had not taken power from him. The authority had been given freely, with complete approval and a father's blessing. Camilla agreed to stand beside her husband, accepting that their public role had shifted, even though their place within the family remained. Catherine joined William during a private rehearsal and noticed him pause beside the coronation chair. The coronation chair is the historic seat in which British monarchs receive the crown. The princess reached for his hand. He told her he no longer viewed the throne as something replacing Charles. He saw it as a duty his father had trusted him to carry. Catherine reminded him that humility, not certainty, would be the thing that protected him in the years ahead. Anne visited Charles once the final arrangements had been signed off. The princess had protected the date, blocked delay, and held the family together when emotion had threatened to tear the process apart. The king thanked her for preserving both the monarchy and his bond with William. She answered that the hardest act of service had been his decision to let go. The final documented account erased any lingering doubt. Charles had chosen the 17th of October, signed the transition order himself, and personally instructed Anne to prevent any interference. The transition order was the written command that set the transfer of royal authority into motion. His departure was not a defeat. It was his final sovereign decision. That morning, Charles closed the red box holding his last active papers. A red box is the secure case used to carry official state documents to the monarch. Somewhere else in the palace, William opened his first. The crown had passed. Charles left in sacrifice. William began in humility. And Anne made sure that neither man faced that moment alone. There was no struggle left unresolved, only sorrow, dignity, and peace. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.